She sat on the sidewalk, shivering under a thin blanket. Her face was lined with years of hardship, her eyes fixed on a single photograph, a reminder of a life she barely remembered. People passed by without a glance. To them, she was invisible. Then, a man stopped, J.D. Vance. At first, no one thought much of it, just another politician shaking hands, maybe offering a few kind words before moving on. But what he did next, no one saw it coming, and when the truth came out, the entire country was left stunned. J.D. Vance had seen hardship before. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. His past was filled with struggle, growing up in a broken home, watching addiction tear families apart, and fighting for a future that seemed just out of reach. That's why, when he saw her, he didn't just walk by. The woman sat outside a convenience store in Cincinnati. Her clothes were worn, her hands covered in dirt, and her hair tangled from years of neglect. Most people avoided looking at her. She wasn't holding a sign or asking for money. She just sat there staring at the photo in her hands. J.D. stepped closer. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. She looked up slowly. Her eyes were dull, tired, like someone who had long stopped expecting kindness. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she held up the photograph, her fingers shaking. It was a picture of a man in uniform, young, strong, full of life. The name stitched onto his chest was barely visible, but J.D. could make it out. It was a military photo. That's when J.D. knew this woman wasn't just another person down on her luck. She was someone with a story, and whatever had happened to her, it had left her broken. "Who is he?" J.D. asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "My son." J.D. felt something tighten in his chest. He glanced around, noticing the way people passed without a second thought. No one stopped to ask her name. No one wondered how she ended up here. But he did, and what he uncovered about her past was something no one expected. J.D. Vance crouched down beside her, ignoring the curious glances from people passing by. His voice was calm but firm. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if she had to search for the answer. "Ellen," she finally said. J.D. nodded. "Ellen, do you have somewhere to stay?" She gave a bitter laugh. "This is it." He glanced at the photograph again. The young soldier staring back at him looked familiar, but he couldn't place where he had seen him before. "Your son, what happened to him?" Ellen's grip on the photo tightened. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, she took a shaky breath. "He died," she said. "Afghanistan. 5 years ago." J.D. felt a chill run through him. He had met veterans, heard their stories of war, but he had also seen what happened to the families they left behind. Some received support, others struggled, and some, like Ellen, fell through the cracks, forgotten by the very country their loved ones had served. "Do you have any other family?" he asked. Ellen shook her head. "It was just me and him. After he was gone, I lost everything." Her voice broke on the last word, and for the first time, J.D. noticed the faint trace of dignity still clinging to her. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't asking for anything. But that didn't mean she didn't need help. J.D. took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Not now. Then, he did something that no one expected. J.D. Vance wasn't the kind of man to make empty promises. He had seen too many people offer words without action, and he wasn't about to be one of them. He stood up, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Ellen watched him with wary eyes, as if she had learned not to trust kindness. "What are you doing?" she asked. J.D. covered the phone for a second. "Getting you help." She shook her head. "Don't bother. People try. It never lasts." But J.D. wasn't listening. A few moments later, he ended the call and looked down at her. "Come on," he said. Ellen hesitated. "Where?" "To get you somewhere warm. Somewhere safe." For the first time in a long time, Ellen saw something in someone's eyes that she hadn't seen in years, genuine concern. She didn't move at first. The idea of trusting a stranger, even one as well known as J.D., felt impossible. But then she looked at the photograph again. Her son had died serving this country. Would he want her to keep living like this? Slowly, she reached for J.D.'s outstretched hand. As he helped her to her feet, No one watching realized that this was just the beginning of a story that would shake the entire country. Because what J.D. Vance did next would leave millions speechless. J.D. Vance walked beside Ellen as they made their way down the street. A black SUV pulled up moments later, and a man stepped out. Someone J.D. had called for help. "Ellen, this is Mark," J.D. said. "He runs a veteran outreach program." Mark extended his hand. Ellen hesitated before shaking it, her grip weak but steady. "Nice to meet you," she murmured. Mark nodded. "We have a place for you. A warm bed, food, whatever you need to get back on your feet." Ellen didn't answer. She had heard promises before. Shelters that couldn't keep her safe. Programs that lasted a few weeks before she was back on the streets. But this time, something felt different. J.D. Vance watched her carefully. "I won't leave you alone in this," he said. "But I need you to trust me." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. Then finally, she gave a small nod. She climbed into the SUV, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than despair. But what happened next was something even J.D. didn't see coming. Because as they worked to get Ellen help, they uncovered something shocking about her past. Something that would make headlines across the country. Days passed as J.D. Vance and Mark worked tirelessly to get Ellen the help she needed. They arranged for her to stay at a veterans facility, one that could offer her therapy and resources she hadn't had access to in years. But no one could have predicted what would happen when they began looking into her son's death. It all started when J.D. made a call to the Department of Defense, requesting records on Ellen's son, Sergeant Matthew Ford, the young soldier who had died in Afghanistan 5 years ago. At first it seemed like a routine inquiry, just another tragic casualty of war. But when the records arrived, something didn't add up. J.D.'s heart sank as he sifted through the pages, his eyes scanning the documents that were meant to be public knowledge. Matthew Ford's death wasn't just a random tragedy of war. It was far more complicated. A letter in the file caught his eye. It was dated only a few months after Matthew's death. The contents were chilling. Matthew had been part of a covert military operation, one that was still classified, and his death wasn't an accident. J.D.'s mind raced. How had this never come to light before? Why was Ellen never told the truth? He called Mark immediately. "We need to talk," J.D. said, his voice tight. "There's something in the records that doesn't make sense." Mark arrived at J.D.'s office within minutes. Together they pored over the files, trying to piece together the mystery. It became clear that Matthew's death was tied to a secret military mission that involved more than just standard combat. But what struck J.D. the most was one small detail buried at the bottom of a page. Matthew Ford was set to testify about the operation just weeks before he died. J.D. leaned back in his chair, stunned. Was this just a coincidence, or was there more to Ellen's story than anyone had realized? This discovery would not only change Ellen's life, it would shake the foundation of what the public knew about military operations and cover-ups. And it would force J.D. Vance to make a decision that would risk everything. J.D. stared at the documents in front of him, the weight of what he had just uncovered pressing down on him. The more he read, the more it became clear that Matthew Ford's death was no ordinary casualty. He had been killed because he was about to expose something powerful people didn't want anyone to know. What J.D. had found wasn't just a tragic story of a soldier lost in combat. It was a cover-up, a secret mission that had gone terribly wrong. And now, 5 years later, Matthew's mother, Ellen, was still living in the dark. J.D. clenched his jaw. He had to do something. If he just let this go, nothing would change. Ellen would never know the truth about her son's sacrifice. Worse, the system would continue to sweep her and others like her under the rug. "Mark," J.D. said, looking up, "this isn't just about helping Ellen anymore. We have to expose this." Mark looked at him, his expression cautious. "You know what this could mean, right? It's not just about taking down corrupt politicians. It's bigger than that. We're talking about a whole network of people who are going to do everything they can to bury this." J.D. didn't hesitate. "I don't care. Ellen deserves the truth, and so does this country. People need to know what happened to Matthew, and they need to know why no one's talking about it." But as JD made the call to bring the information to light, he knew the risk he was taking. He wasn't just putting his career on the line, he was putting his safety, and the safety of everyone involved, at risk. The people behind the operation that had killed Matthew Ford would stop at nothing to keep their secret safe. As JD began to gather evidence and prepare for a public reveal, something unexpected happened. News outlets began to catch wind of the story. Small reports trickled out, and before long, social media was buzzing. Ellen's story was going viral, and people were demanding answers. The pressure mounted. The country was watching, and Ellen's grief had become a symbol of the broken promises made to military families. But just as the investigation was gaining momentum, JD received an anonymous tip. He stared at his phone, reading the message over and over. It was a warning. Stop digging into Matthew Ford's death. The truth will cost you more than you're willing to pay. JD felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but he wasn't backing down. He couldn't. Ellen had trusted him. Now it was his turn to trust that exposing the truth would lead to something bigger than just justice for her son. It was a chance to shake the very system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. And with that, JD made a promise to himself. He was going all in. The days that followed were nothing like JD had ever experienced before. What started as a personal mission to help Ellen find closure quickly spiraled into something much larger, a full-blown national scandal. The pressure to expose the truth was mounting, and JD felt the weight of it with every step he took. News outlets began digging into Matthew Ford's military records, finding contradictions and red flags that no one had ever bothered to investigate before. The story hit headlines, and suddenly, people from all over the country were rallying behind Ellen, demanding that the government answer for its mistakes. But the more JD uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. The military's involvement in a covert operation that led to Matthew's death wasn't just a botched mission, it was a mess of lies, cover-ups, and manipulation. In the weeks that followed, JD's phone rang constantly, with reporters, insiders, and government officials all trying to either offer him information or silence him. He even received several warnings. One evening, his car was blocked by an unmarked vehicle. He was followed. It wasn't subtle. The threats weren't just about him. They were about Ellen. The more the public demanded answers, the more those trying to keep the truth buried took desperate measures. But JD had never been one to back down from a fight. He wasn't about to let anyone intimidate him into silence. Then the unthinkable happened. Ellen received a phone call in the middle of the night. It was a voice she didn't recognize, low, harsh, and filled with venom. "Stop this now," the voice said. "You don't know who you're messing with." The line went dead. Ellen's hands shook as she set the phone down, her mind racing. She had been quiet for years, hiding in the shadows, barely clinging to life. But now, as her son's death became the focal point of a national firestorm, her past was threatening to swallow her whole. But JD wouldn't let her back down. He promised her that he'd be there, no matter what. The next day, JD met with Ellen. The look in her eyes had changed. She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a woman ready to fight for the truth about her son. "We can't stop now, JD," she said, her voice steady. "Matthew deserves justice, and I deserve to know what really happened." JD nodded. Together they forged ahead, determined to expose the dark secrets that had taken far too many lives, and to bring the truth to the surface, no matter the cost. The walls were closing in, but Ellen and JD were no longer afraid. The tension was unbearable as JD and Ellen made the decision to go public with the entire story. They knew the risks, they had seen the threats, the intimidation, the way those in power had tried to silence them at every turn. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth had to be revealed. JD's next move was calculated. He knew that the only way to make sure the story didn't get buried was to take it to the highest platform possible. It wasn't just about revealing the injustice done to Ellen and her son. It was about showing the world how deep the corruption ran, and how far people were willing to go to protect their secrets. He set up a press conference, and the day it was scheduled, the media descended. Reporters from all over the country flooded the room. their cameras flashing as they waited for JD to speak. Ellen stood beside him, her hands still shaking, but her resolve unwavering. The first few questions from the reporters were predictable, simple inquiries about Ellen's background, her son, the circumstances surrounding his death. JD answered them all calmly, but there was a sense that everyone in the room was waiting for the bombshell, and then JD dropped it. I've just come from meeting with several veterans who were part of the mission Matthew Ford was involved in, JD said, his voice steady, but his eyes locked on the crowd. What I'm about to share with you is the reason why this story hasn't been told before. It's the reason Matthew's death has been covered up for so long. The room fell silent. Matthew Ford wasn't just killed in a routine mission. He was about to testify against illegal operations conducted by a covert group in the military. Operations that resulted in the deaths of countless innocent civilians. But Matthew was silenced, his life taken to ensure he never spoke out. The reporters exchanged glances, their pens scribbling furiously. We've seen the documents, JD continued. We've spoken with people who were there, and we've uncovered the lies the government has been telling you for years. But that's not where this ends. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Ellen Ford, the mother of the man who sacrificed everything for this country, deserves to know the truth. And so does every single person who has ever been let down by this system. For a moment, the room was eerily quiet. Then a murmur spread. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was an awakening. People were starting to understand the scope of what had happened. But just as JD was about to speak again, a voice interrupted him. We have no comment at this time. The crowd turned to see a group of government officials standing at the back of the room. Their cold stares were enough to make anyone uneasy. But JD wasn't intimidated. The truth is out now, JD said. It doesn't matter how much you try to bury it. The people will hear it. It was then that the first reporter asked the question that everyone had been wondering. Why did you wait so long to reveal this? JD's gaze flicked to Ellen, and he could see the tears in her eyes. The truth was raw, painful, and the cost of exposing it had been steep. But they were finally here, finally telling the world what had really happened. Because people like Ellen were ignored, they were pushed aside. The system failed her, and it failed her son. But we're going to fix that, and we'll make sure no one else is forgotten. The press conference ended with a roar of questions and camera flashes. The weight of what had just happened was still sinking in. But JD and Ellen knew that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of media attention. Ellen's story, along with the revelations about her son's death, became a trending topic across the nation. People were angry, people were upset, and people were demanding justice. The pressure on those in power was mounting, and JD was right at the center of it all. He had taken a stand, and now, the country was watching. As the story spread, the public's reaction was overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Ellen, as well as outrage at the government's actions. News outlets from every corner of the country began to run stories about Matthew Ford's untold mission, the cover-up, and the devastating consequences of the lies that had been fed to the public for years. Ellen's name was suddenly everywhere. She was no longer the quiet, homeless woman on the streets. She had become the face of a much larger issue, the abandonment of veterans and their families, the neglect, and the horrifying truths that were being hidden. JD's phone rang off the hook. Interviews, podcasts, news segments. People wanted to hear his side, wanted to know more about the investigation, and the shocking revelations about military corruption. But it wasn't just about JD anymore. It was about Ellen. The media began focusing on her story, her grief, her struggle, and her fight for justice. And with every new interview, Ellen grew stronger. She was no longer the broken woman who had wandered the streets. She was a mother determined to ensure her son's sacrifice was never forgotten. But just as the momentum seemed unstoppable, the powers that be began pushing back. Government officials began scrambling to cover their tracks. Anonymous sources within the military tried to discredit JD, casting doubt on his findings. They claimed the documents were fabricated, that the veterans he had spoken to were unreliable. They even went so far as to accuse JD of having an agenda. But JD wasn't backing down. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been ignored by the system, for every soldier who had given their life for a cause they didn't fully understand, for every mother, father, and spouse who had been left in the dark, their pain unacknowledged. As the pressure from the government mounted, JD knew there was no turning back. He had made a promise to Ellen, and he wasn't about to let her down. That's when the final blow came. One evening, after a particularly intense interview, JD received a phone call. It was from an unknown number. He answered, and the voice on the other end was chilling. "Stop digging, JD," the voice said, its tone cold and calculated. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself or for her." JD's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't the first threat he'd received, but there was something different about this one. The voice was confident, almost as if they knew something JD's heart didn't. "I'm not stopping," JD replied, his voice steady. "The truth will come out. People deserve to know what happened to Matthew Ford." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice spoke again, this time slower. "You won't be able to protect her forever, JD. You've dug too deep, and you're both in way over your heads." The line went dead. JD stood frozen, the weight of the threat settling on him. He wasn't just up against the government anymore. He was up against something bigger, something that had no intention of letting the truth out. But as he thought about Ellen, about her son, and about everything they had sacrificed, JD made one decision. He would not stop, and he would not let them win. The threats kept coming. JD was no longer just worried about his own safety. He was worried about Ellen, about the people who had stepped forward to help them, and about the lives that could be destroyed if they didn't finish what they started. As the tension reached its breaking point, JD knew that they needed one final push to make sure the truth would stick. The government and military officials were desperate to cover their tracks, but Ellen's story had already gained too much attention. The public was on her side, demanding justice, but JD had to take a calculated risk. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He called in a team of investigative journalists he had worked with before, people who had a track record of exposing corruption at the highest levels. Together they worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence, interviewing key witnesses, and connecting the dots that the government had tried to bury for so long. Then they got a break. One of the veterans who had been part of the covert mission, someone who had been silenced for years, agreed to go public. His testimony was the missing piece of the puzzle, the final confirmation that Matthew Ford had been murdered because he was about to expose a massive cover-up. The veteran spoke on camera, recounting the details of the mission and the events leading up to Matthew's death. With this new piece of evidence in hand, JD and the team published their findings. The story hit the media like a tidal wave. Headlines screamed across every major news outlet. Cover-up exposed the truth behind Matthew Ford's death. The government had nowhere to hide. Within days the fallout was massive. The officials responsible for the operation were put under investigation. Some were forced to resign. Others faced criminal charges. And Ellen Ford, the grieving mother who had been ignored for years, was finally getting the recognition she deserved. But JD knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many others who had been left behind by the system. But for the first time in a long while, JD could see the glimmer of hope. Ellen stood by his side as the story unfolded. She had become more than just a victim. She had become a symbol of resilience and strength. The woman who had once wandered the streets, forgotten and abandoned, was now a national hero. People reached out from all over the country, offering support and standing with her as she demanded justice for her son. The day the story broke, JD received a message from an unknown number. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a message of gratitude. "Thank you for giving me back my son's voice," it read. "You didn't just fight for me. You fought for every person like me. You fought for the truth." JD couldn't help but smile as he read the message. He had made the right choice. And as for Ellen, She found the closure she had been searching for. The weight of her son's sacrifice was finally being acknowledged. Matthew Ford's name would never be forgotten again. But the journey wasn't over. There were still others out there, other veterans who had fallen through the cracks, other families who had been silenced by the same corrupt system. JD made a promise to continue the fight, to make sure the stories of those who had been ignored would be heard. And with that, JD and Ellen knew one thing for sure: the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. And this time, it wasn't just a story, it was a movement,